Let's go ahead and tackle the big elephant in the room, probably the most widely known and speculated event that happened in the United States back in 1947. I'm talking about the Roswell incident. July 8th, 1947, the newspapers announced that the RAAF captures a flying saucer on a ranch in Roswell. Now, for those of you that don't know the story and you've been living under a rock, Mac Brazel had a ranch, and on this ranch, there was a big thunderstorm the night before. The next day, he hears this, during the night, he hears this loud crash. So he goes and investigates his land the next day, and there's this debris field that's about 2 miles long of this material that he's never seen. So he calls the local authorities. Well, the military comes out, and I believe it was Jesse Marcel, who was one of the original Army officers who came out and assisted with picking up the debris. Now, the interesting thing is that Mac Brazel was basically taken by the military and withheld for a couple of days. He was told not to talk about the incident. He was threatened that if he told the truth about the incident, that life would be rough for him. Jesse Marcel, who collected the debris, took the initial things to Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas. He also took some of the debris to his house before then and showed his wife and his son, Jesse Marcel Jr. Now, the next day, when they put this story out, the military decides to change their story. That it wasn't a UFO, it wasn't a flying saucer. Now they're going to say it's a weather balloon. Now, I got to ask you something, folks. The United States military are not daft enough. They're not that stupid that they would put out a press release saying, oh, yeah, we can't tell the difference from an alien craft to something that has rubber bands, aluminum foil, and fucking tape.
And debris. I mean, yeah, okay, a weather balloon's going to leave that much debris.
A weather balloon is like 12 feet long.
I've seen them, yeah.
You're gonna mistake a weather balloon for a flying metallic disc that leaves a debris field 2 miles wide. Really? You know, and people will believe what the government tells them. It's always been that way. Why would my government lie to me? Why would they lie? What's the purpose of withholding the information? Why? Maybe because they feel that the world, the United States, the people can't handle the truth. Because at the height of this, the U.S. was involved in the Cold War, and maybe that was one of the reasons they withheld it. Had it been a Russian craft, I'm sure they would have withheld it as well. But, well, go ahead.
I don't even know about that, because if it was a Russian craft, you would think that the U.S. government would want to gloat over that. You know, look at these freaking idiots. They crash landed trying to conduct spy missions. It just goes to show how stupid they are. That would have been a more believable explanation than a fucking weather balloon, and it'd be something that the U.S. government could use to their advantage. So if it was a Russian craft, I don't think they would have covered it up. They would have bragged on it.
I agree. But back to the story here. On July 8th, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield Public Information Officer, Walter Hott, issued a press release stating that personnel from the field's 509th Operations Group had recovered a flying disc, which had crashed on the ranch near Roswell. Later that day, the press reported that Commanding General of the 8th Air Force, Roger Ramey, had stated that a weather balloon was recovered by the RAAF personnel. A press conference was held featuring debris, foil, rubber, and wood, said to be from the crashed object, which seemed to confirm its description as a weather balloon. Subsequently, the incident faded from the attention of UFO researchers for over 30 years until 1978, when ufologist Stanton Friedman interviewed Major Jesse Marcel, who was involved in the original recovery of the debris in 1947. Marcel expressed his belief the military covered up the recovery of an alien spacecraft. His story spread through UFO circles, being featured in some of the UFO documentaries at the time. In February 1980, the National Enquirer ran its own interview with Marcel, garnering national and worldwide attention for the Roswell incident. Additional witnesses added significant new details, including claims of large-scale military operation dedicated to recovering alien craft and aliens themselves, at as many as 11 different crash sites, and alleged witness intimidation. In 1989, former mortician Glenn Dennis put forth a detailed personal account where he claimed alien autopsies were carried out at the Roswell base. Now, I saw this story on Unsolved Mysteries, and Glenn Dennis maintains that the military had called the funeral home up, and they wanted small children coffins. Now, why would a military call and ask the funeral home for smaller caskets that you would bury children in? First of all, especially at a time when they just recovered some kind of an object, and they're now claiming it's a weather balloon. So he shows up and delivers this stuff. Well, as he's leaving, a nurse comes out of there, one of the doors in the building, and is crying, and he talks to her for a brief second. And then a general comes up to him and tells him to get the hell off the base, and if he talks about anything he's seen, that there'll be consequences. And he goes, well, I don't work for the military. I'll do whatever I want. And the general basically tells him that he'll put him in the ground if he says a word. So allegedly, Glenn Dennis meets up, I guess, the next day or a couple days after this with the nurse that he saw at the base that apparently was someone that he knew. And she claims that they were doing an alien autopsy on one of the inhabitants. She said that one of the bodies was very badly mangled, and they were strange looking, and they gave off a horrible smell. And that their fingers had like little suction cups at the end, and they were 3-fingered beings. And they were about 3 feet tall. 3 to 4 feet. And this is the guy who worked for the funeral home that called from the military and wanted small caskets for bodies. Makes you wonder.
Well, last time I checked, they don't let kids in the military.
You know, and then the alleged military, the military came out and said that the alleged bodies that were recovered were dummies that they used in a weather balloon to, I don't know what their official response was, but supposedly they were using dummies in the weather balloons. There was no alien beings that were recovered from the crash site. They were dummies. They were smaller wooden dummies that were badly disfigured. I guess they were going to bury the dummies in the caskets. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just about to say, well, then why the fuck would you need caskets?
But if you've seen Unsolved Mysteries, you've seen the report of Glenn Dennis. There's just too many people that have come out and said things. Even Jesse Marcel himself on his deathbed claimed that they covered this thing up. That what he took to his family, and his son is one of the only people to allegedly hold a piece of the alien craft in his hand, and it was a small beam with hieroglyphic type things on it. And he's described it. There's just too many credible witnesses out there that have been silenced by the military. You know, the funny thing, back to the Glenn Dennis story, the nurse that he knew, she disappeared a couple days after that, was never seen again, never heard from.
Well, obviously that general went through with his threat. I mean, you know, there's also a commonality among this. All these hoaxes involve hieroglyphic-looking materials. Now, let's see, that's 2 so far we've got. We've got the one we just spoke about, the one in the 1890s, hieroglyphics. We've got this one from the 1940s, hieroglyphics. So that's so far 2. So that's just a coincidence?
Exactly. I just, again, draw your own conclusions, folks. Believe what you want to believe. But I have a hard time believing that the U.S. military is incompetent and can't tell the difference from a craft not of this world to a weather balloon. The debris-filled enough should be the smoking gun here.
Well, did anybody ever go to these guys and say, why the hell did you have manic? Well, first of all, how would you fit? A weather balloon won't even take off with even 2-3-foot mannequins. It's not possible. For a balloon to carry 2 things that heavy, you need probably one similar to the kind humans ride in. Did anyone ever say, well, why the fuck did you have mannequins? And I mean, that's a piss poor excuse if I ever heard one.
That's pretty bad. In the early 1990s, UFO researchers such as Stanton Friedman, William Moore, Carl T. Flock, and a team of Kevin D. Randall and Donald R. Smith interviewed several hundred people who had or claimed to have had a connection with the events at Roswell in 1947. Additionally, hundreds of documents were obtained via Freedom of Information Act requests, and some were supposedly leaked by insiders, such as the so-called Majestic 12 papers. Their conclusions were at least one alien craft had crashed in the Roswell vicinity. Aliens, some possibly still alive, were recovered, and a massive cover-up of any knowledge of the incident was put into place.
There you have it. I mean, it's still going on 50 years later. You know, they're still investigating this thing, and there's hundreds of people. Guess it's too many for the government to kill.
Like I said, you can only silence so many. You know, if it was one or two people and they said, yeah, aliens was on my property, they crash landed, you know, and it was Bubba the redneck from Georgia, maybe you might think that he's making it up. But when you've got hundreds of people, and most of them are probably considered credible witnesses, there's something to that, folks.
Well, there's even a few people who are pretty goddamn high up, even in government, who came forward and said that these things were real. You know, who of course, eventually went back and, you know, recanted their statements, probably after their whole fucking family was threatened. I mean, you know, it's just like you said, it's not 2 or 3 or 4 people who are saying this. You could say, they're trying to get attention. They're trying to get their names in the news. They're trying to sell their story for some money. No, this is hundreds of people. Probably, if we sat here and really went through it, probably tens of thousands of people in the last 100 or so years who have reported this stuff.
No doubt about that. But, you know, I mentioned off the top of the broadcast that not only is the U.S. government responsible for, you know, cover-ups of, well, all kinds of things, you know, presidential assassinations, UFO, you know, recoveries and crashes. No, other governments are involved in this too. And there is a case that happened in 1974 in Coyame, Mexico. Now, the interesting thing about this is the United States had picked up this object on radar that was heading towards the United States, and then it zigzagged back into Mexico. Well, this happened on August 24th, 1974. It was headed toward Corpus Christi, Texas. Suddenly, the object changed directions and headed toward Coyame, Chihuahua, Mexico. At approximately the same time, a small airplane took off from El Paso, Texas, heading towards Mexico City. The U.S. radar detected both the UFO and the small plane and monitored both until their signals simultaneously disappeared at the same location over Mexico. The Mexican government sent a team to recover the small plane and its passengers, while the U.S. continued to monitor the situation. The U.S. military offered its recovery expertise to the Mexican government, but the Mexicans denied that anything had actually happened. Well, the U.S. government started getting satellite info showing that the Mexicans had went to the crash site and they had taken something from the crash site. Now, when they get to the crash site, not only is there a small plane there, there's also another object that's not as badly damaged and destroyed as the airplane. They find an alien craft. Here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. military sent 4 Huey helicopters and a 15-man recovery team to head to Coyame, Mexico. They entered Mexico and intercepted a radio communication giving away the location of the crash site. Upon the arrival to the crash location in Mexico, the American group came across a strange metallic object in the shape of a disc, exhibiting what appeared to be a frontal impact and noticeable wreckage. Together with the burned remains of the small plane, a Cessna 180, a short distance from the wreckage was also an olive green Jeep belonging to the military and containing the bodies of 4 Mexican soldiers. Their bodies displayed signs of death by asphyxiation. They were also in possession of their firearms, but showed no evidence of attempting to use them. One of the American Huey helicopters picked up the UFO and carried it some 15 kilometers, where an American convoy waited to take it via the rail to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The interesting thing about this story, folks, is that the Mexican government denies that any of this ever happened, as does the U.S. government. However, the 4 soldiers that I told you had died, there actually is proof they died that weekend. The government denies they even exist. It's funny, though, that they would show up as dying during an operation that never happened, and they don't exist, even though research was done to prove that they did die that day and they did exist.
Well, I mean, what is all these lame excuses? What do they have in common? They seem like they're created out of panic, that they're so afraid that people will find out exactly what happened that rather than sit down and think of a plausible excuse, take the 3 bodies, fire a few bullets into them and say, hey, they died, fighting some whatever, enemy forces, whatever. We don't know what happened. But to say they didn't exist. And another thing that's interesting, I'm looking right now at the flight plan of this object, and it starts off from, I would say, the southeast. It's flying northwest. It's about to go towards Corpus Christi and then immediately makes a 180 and flies directly south till about the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and then turns back around and flies north and crashes here. The flight plan forms like an N shape. The only thing that can fly like that is either a bird or a craft under someone's control.
Correct.
It's not possible. You can't say this one's a balloon because I'm looking at the flight path. It made 2 turns. 2 turns in a completely opposite direction.
You know what else is very interesting? The U.S. government decides to stick their nose in this because they know that the Mexican government is recovering an alien craft. So they show up, and the Mexicans give them no resistance. They don't want this thing because it's killed 4 of their soldiers. They don't know how they've died. So the U.S. government convinces them that, hey, we've got more, obviously more experience in dealing with these things. They just give it up. They just tell them to take it. Now, as I said, the whereabouts to this UFO to this day are still unknown. As for the dead Mexican soldiers, the Mexican military denies that the incident ever took place, that despite overwhelming evidence presented in Mexican radio reports at the time and the available at the General Archives of Radio Communications of the Mexican military, the names and ranks of the soldiers are to this day officially denied by the Mexican government as well. That is telling. There's another smoking gun for you right there.
Well, I mean, either the Mexican government didn't want it, or maybe some higher ups in the U.S. contacted them and said, listen, we're serious this time. Be quiet or we'll nuke your freaking country. We'll find a reason to do it.
I don't think they said we'll nuke your country. I don't think that ever happened. But I don't even think it's the U.S. government saying, hey, keep this under wraps. I think the Mexican government, I think governments feel that they need to cover this stuff up. Now, do I think that something should be covered up when it comes to classified stuff, when they're maybe experimenting with weapons and stuff? Sure. Maybe the government, everybody doesn't need to know everything, but I think that when it comes to alien beings from other planets visiting this planet, and the U.S. government knows about it, or any government knows about it, I think maybe it's time for disclosure, because to me, there's enough stories out here. There's a lot of alien hoaxes, right? There's a lot of UFO hoaxes that are faked. You go on YouTube and you look shit up, and there's a lot of them that are digitally enhanced, people thinking that they're the next, fucking George Lucas putting together this shit and putting it out there. And then there are UFO footages that you see that you cannot explain, that are not faked, that just defy explanation. And again, I think that while secrets are okay on some things, I think it's time for full disclosure, because there's just too many things that tell me that this is not a hoax. This is not a bullshit story that people have put out over the years.
Well, you also have to look at it objectively to say what would be the better scenario. Slowly disclose this stuff and calmly disclose it and get people desensitized to it? Or do you wait for the day when a freaking craft that's just too big and doesn't crash and just lands on its own comes? That's going to be a lot bigger shock to society than if the governments were just to disclose it very slowly. Look, yeah, this did happen. Yeah, we have proof. You're still going to create a lot of panic. There's still going to be some stupid people who are going to go crazy. But I think it's a less of a cultural shock than, a scenario like fucking Independence Day, where one day one of these things is just hovering above New York City or Calgary or whatever.
I agree. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we've got 3 more stories to talk about, one of which happened not in the U.S. It happened in Brazil. So I told you we had a couple stories that didn't involve the U.S. military or the U.S. government doing a cover-up. But this one involves Brazil, and we've also got some other stuff to talk about. But we're going to be right back with more Unplugged CT right here on the SNS Radio Network right after this.